History is not all about names and dates. It's about humanity's greatest stories. Fiction and primetime TV have nothing on the real stories that put them all to shame. This is a delicious appetizer that can be filling on its own, but leaves you wanting more. Like nachos. History nachos. Villains are not born. They are made. This guy's actions shaped the entire 20th century, and we are still living with the consequences. As a teenager, he saw his brother hanged for daring to defy the monarchy. Later, he discovered radical ideas and got in with a revolutionary crowd. He became obsessed with one goal: bring down the monarchy and create the first real-life Marxist state. His homeland's enemies shared his goal of destroying the government, which is why they smuggled him home to sow chaos during a major war. He would succeed, kill the royal family, and establish the world's first Marxist country, the Soviet Union. Welcome to Episode 3, the Halloween Villain Special, Vladimir Lenin and the Coup of the Century. Victorious warriors win first, then go to war. Sun Tzu, The Art of War, 5th century BC. Sun Tzu wrote that about warfare, but it also applies to politics. And it's exactly what Lenin did. The takeover in 1917 is his most famous event, but it would not have been possible without the buildup. Lenin won long before he officially tried to take over. Vladimir Lenin did not start out as a villain. As a teenager, Lenin was a smart kid, graduated first in his class from high school, and came from a loving family. His parents were both highly educated, and his father had risen up from humble beginnings to become a school teacher and education official. The family was comfortable, which was more than most Russians could say at the time. Lenin grew up in Tsarist Russia, which was a monarchy where the Tsar had absolute authority. While Western Europe underwent sweeping changes from the Enlightenment and the Industrial Revolution, they really didn't hit Russia as a whole. It remained more of a traditional monarchy, closer to a medieval kingdom. The Tsars usually tried to keep a tight lid on things like education and freedom of speech in order to stay in power. As a result, Russia was always behind the curve when it came to technology and other modern advances. Ideas from the West started to leak in anyway. Russians were beginning to wake up and realize they had a raw deal. In a monarchy, it hugely matters who wears the crown. Tsar Alexander II was in power when Lenin was a kid. This Tsar was a reformer who abolished serfdom and pushed for modernization. At least until there was an assassination attempt on him. Then the Tsar figured he had gotten a little too carried away with this whole freedom thing. He then did a 180 and started oppressing the people, which later resulted in his actual assassination. Lenin was 11 years old when the Tsar was killed. The new Tsar, Alexander III, decided to continue repressing the people after his father's demise. Under him, the Russian government countered the rise of free thought by clamping down on education. As part of the crackdown, the government tried to pressure Lenin's dad to retire early. Lenin's dad died out of nowhere from a brain hemorrhage shortly afterward, but Lenin saw the oppression up close and personal. Alexander III would rule until Lenin was in his mid-20s. Keep that in mind, because opposing Alexander III's government is what transformed Lenin into a revolutionary. Anyway, Lenin's older brother Alexander was a college student in St. Petersburg, which was Russia's capital and one of the main contact points with the West. Alexander became one of the Russians who realized how badly the regime was treating the people and decided to take action against the monarchy. He joined in a conspiracy to kill Alexander III, but got busted. The government promptly hanged him. Now at 17, Lenin was the male head of the family. Fortunately, he did not have to support his mother and 4 siblings, since his mother had a pension and inheritance they could live on. But the damage was done. Lenin had seen the Tsarist government oppress his father for promoting education and kill his beloved older brother. These 2 events are considered what started him down the path to becoming a revolutionary. Personally, I think the lack of positive male guidance from this point forward also had something to do with it. As a high school junior, Lenin's world fell apart, and the men in his life who would normally be there to help him through it were gone. Lenin began transforming from a smart but normal kid into something else entirely. To me, at this point, Lenin sounds a lot like Anakin Skywalker from the Star Wars prequels. Anakin started out a nice kid, but after the loss of his mom, anger overtook him. When Anakin was a teenager, his mom was killed by Tusken Raiders, who were the people in power out in the deserts of Tatooine. It wasn't fair, and Anakin's anger fueled him into thinking he needed to do something drastic. That's how Anakin first started turning to the dark side. I think the same thing happened to Lenin. Lenin managed to get into college and begin studying law, but that didn't last long. Within 3 months, he was expelled for participating in an illegal student demonstration. The government ordered him to live at his grandpa's rural estate and basically do nothing. He was pretty much under house arrest with his sister, who was also an activist in a similar situation. That gave Lenin time to think, which just turned him against the government even more. His mother eventually pulled some strings and got Lenin back into civilization, but he was not allowed to resume college for that school year. This gave Lenin more time to think, but now he was around other people. He met some older revolutionaries living in exile who introduced him to the works of Karl Marx. Marx's ideas struck a nerve, and within 2 years, Lenin would become a full-blown Marxist. I just can't help but think of Merle Haggard's iconic words. No one could steer me right, but Mama tried, Mama tried. Mama tried to raise me better, but her pleading I denied. That leaves only me to blame, 'cause Mama tried. In order to understand what drove Lenin, you need to understand Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, the founders of Marxist ideology. They lived in the mid-1800s and saw the Industrial Revolution really take off. A big part of the Industrial Revolution was the rise of factories, which back then had terrible conditions. I won't get graphic because it would turn your stomach. Marx and Engels sympathized for average workers and blamed the horrific conditions on the factory owners, who Marx and Engels saw as greedy and oppressive due to their wealth and status. Marx and Engels believed history was a constant repeating pattern of class warfare between the poor and the rich. In short, the rich perpetually exploited the poor for their own gain. That's why Marx and Engels came up with a radical idea: seize the means of production away from the owners and put them in the hands of the workers. Basically, it means there are no more owners. Everything belongs to everyone. No more wealth, no more poverty either. If this all seems a bit weird and conceptual, you're in good company. The attitude is summed up pretty well by the naive idealism from the famous song Imagine by John Lennon. Things didn't quite work out the way Marx and Engels thought they would. Their theory is one of those things that sounds good, but completely falls apart when you actually try to do it. Anyway, back to Lenin. In Russia, the monarchy was the entity oppressing the people and living the high life. Just replace factory owners with czar, And you can see why Lenin bought into Marxist ideology based on his experiences with the Russian government. Lenin eventually became a criminal defense lawyer in St. Petersburg. Lenin's work mainly involved peasants, so he saw the Tsar's oppression every day at the office, and made a career out of fighting the man. He got in with a crowd of other Marxist lawyers, and things started brewing. When Lenin was 24, Tsar Alexander III died unexpectedly from a kidney condition. Next up on the throne was his son, Nicholas II, who was only 26 and had not yet been trained up for the top job. The Marxists realized that if they got seriously organized, there could be a chance to take over during the reign of a weak Tsar. Lenin was a rising star among the Marxists, so the next year, Lenin's friends sent him on a trip to Western Europe to meet older Russian Marxists who had fled the country. This is pretty similar to when Palpatine befriended Anakin and started channeling his anger to serve the purposes of the Sith. Upon Lenin's return to Russia, he decided to step things up a notch. He created a formal organization to advocate for workers' rights and merged all the Marxist groups in St. Petersburg into it. They did things like public outreach and supporting labor strikes. However, they came up with a truly brilliant technique: infiltrate worker education classes and use them to promote Marxism. This was the early roots of the infamous Soviet brainwashing. The government caught on pretty quickly, and in a matter of months, the ringleaders were in jail, including Lenin. Lenin served 15 months, then got sent to Siberia for 3 years. Once again, Lenin's big mouth had gotten him shipped off to the boonies. However, this time he was not going alone. He was joined by Nadezhda Krupskaya. Nadezhda was a woman who Lenin had met in St. Petersburg when she became involved with his Marxist organization. They were engaged when Lenin was sent to Siberia. By the way, Nadezhda was serving jail time too for her part in Lenin's organization. Since they were engaged, she was allowed to join Lenin in Siberia. She probably figured, if I'm gonna serve time, might as well do it with my boyfriend. They married while in Siberia together. They strike me as similar to the Joker and Harley Quinn from the Batman comics. Siberia was basically Russia's version of Arkham Asylum. When Lenin's term was up in 1900, he left Russia. He was 29. I guess Lenin got tired of going to jail whenever he started to make real headway. Nadezhda joined him in exile a year later after finishing her time. From here on out, she was one of his top advisors. Joker and Harley were free from Arkham. Now it was time to get organized. Lenin met up with older Russian radicals and started formalizing Marxist doctrine in a more practical sense. Marx and Engels had left a rough theoretical structure, but there is a world of difference between theory and practice. Lenin had to define what exactly the finer points of Marxism were. It was a monumental task, so Lenin decided to found a Marxist political party and unite the various Marxist organizations all over Europe. Eventually, a congress was held in London. They spent weeks hammering out the details of formal Marxist doctrine, but finally agreed on a set of party beliefs. Lenin basically created the real-life Legion of Doom to fight the established societies of Europe, which in this case would be the Justice League. Now came the really hard part: applying this stuff to the real world. Most Marxists at the time believed in an inevitable general popular uprising that would result in Marxist socialism. Lenin thought differently. He knew the uprising was far from inevitable. Lenin wanted to focus the revolution on the working class, since a general uprising would just make the middle class the new upper class. And then it would be back to square one. Remember, at the time, this was all uncharted territory. Nobody knew for sure what would really happen if a Marxist uprising occurred. Lenin also believed strict party discipline and a hardened core of professional revolutionaries directing the uprising was the way to go. Even other Marxists thought this more resembled dictatorship and oppression than their stated goal. The issue divided the Russian Marxists, which split into Bolsheviks, that's Russian for majoritarians, and Mensheviks, Russian for the minority. To make a long story short, Lenin led the Bolshevik majority. While Lenin was organizing Marxism, the situation in Russia drastically changed. Things weren't going so well for the Tsar, who was still in his 30s. Russia got humiliated by Japan in the Russo-Japanese War in 1904, which caused popular discontent at home to boil over. Things started to get really intense in 1905 when protesters marched on the Royal Palace in St. Petersburg. The Tsar's men fired on unarmed demonstrators, killing and wounding hundreds of them. This didn't go over well. The Tsar sensed he was on the edge of something seriously bad, so he made political concessions that favored the people. Lenin was 35 and watching the whole time. He saw that things were finally loosening up in Russia, which made him comfortable enough to return. More importantly, he saw that Russia was primed for revolution. However, before Lenin could try anything, he knew he needed to get the Russian people on his side. So Lenin spent the next decade promoting Marxism and laying the groundwork for overthrowing the Tsar. He also ejected the Mensheviks from the party, which made Lenin the uncontested leader. When World War I hit in 1914, war spread all over Europe, and Lenin thought this was the big chance for a pan-European Marxist uprising. He was shocked when Marxists all across Europe put country over ideology and supported the war. Even the other Russian Marxists didn't think this was the time to act. At 44, Lenin left for Switzerland, which was neutral in the war, to plan his next move. While in Switzerland, Lenin became more and more marginalized within the Marxist community as an extremist. Up until this point, Lenin can be seen as a zealous political advocate for a fringe ideology. In my opinion, Switzerland is when Lenin transitions from kooky ideologue into all-out villain. In Switzerland, Lenin doubled down on his assertion that now was the time to act, and got increasingly extreme. Even radicals within the Marxist movement thought Lenin and his hardcore group of followers had gone off the reservation. Lenin had fallen from grace, which gave him nothing to lose. Nadezhda stuck with him through all of this. Lenin went off the deep end, and Nadezhda went with him. Sounds like Joker and Harley to me. In 1917, Lenin finally saw his chance. Since the outset of war, things started to get hairy in Russia. In short, Russia wasn't ready for World War I. It was not going well, and they were losing a lot of men. Soldiers were dying in droves on the front, and the people were starving at home. By 1917, the Tsar's mismanagement of the war finally put the Russian people over the top. In March 1917, food riots swept the capital of St. Petersburg. The soldiers garrisoned there joined in, and the Tsar knew the jig was up. He abdicated, and the next guy in line refused to take the crown. I don't blame him. The age of Tsars ended, and a makeshift provisional government was created. It was a generally democratic government led by moderate socialists, who were an entirely different group from the Marxists. Word of the abdication got back to the Germans, who needed Russia to withdraw from the war in order to have a chance at victory. The Germans concocted a plan. Find the most extremist revolutionary they could to disrupt Russia, take it over, and call off the war. So they sought out the most extreme and effective Marxist leader, Lenin. Okay, this sounds like a Bond villain's master plan. Anyway, the Germans proposed a deal. They would let Lenin through their territory and get him into Russia to take advantage of the weak regime. In exchange, Lenin would wreak havoc behind the Russian lines and call off the war altogether as soon as he could. Lenin took the deal. The Germans sent a luxury train to pick him up in Switzerland. Again, this is stuff I would expect from a James Bond movie. At this point, it's pretty hard to argue Lenin had good intentions, since the whole deal was centered around making life terrible for everyone in Russia. On top of that, he was betraying his country to its historic nemesis. This dude was a combination of Dr. No and Benedict Arnold. Lenin had fully turned to the dark side. Within a month of the Tsar's abdication, Lenin was back in St. Petersburg. While the provisional government had titular power, it was only because the Soviet worker clubs allowed it. A Soviet was kind of like a workers' union branch office. The St. Petersburg Soviet was the most powerful, and it was run by Lenin's old buddies. Everyone went crazy when Lenin came back, since at this point, he was the Mac Daddy professional revolutionary. When he showed up in the capital, it meant things just got real and it was about to go down. The years of preparation were paying off. The Joker was at large in Gotham. Lenin sized up the situation and didn't even bother with the provisional government. If anything, he tried to disrupt it. Instead, Lenin went straight to the Soviet clubs and garnered their support, since they held the real power. Lenin campaigned on a simple message: peace, land, and bread. Immediately end the war, redistribute land, and no more food shortages. The message was targeted directly at the working class, and it resonated. By September, Lenin's Bolsheviks won enough seats to control the major Soviet clubs, including the most powerful one in St. Petersburg. The provisional government found out Lenin was working with the Germans and raised the alarm. Lenin was now a fugitive and had to go underground. Lenin still had popular support, but now the government had an excuse to hunt him down. For a while, Lenin even ran the revolution from Finland. It was kind of like the opening battle from The Empire Strikes Back, when Darth Vader was running the ground operations from his Star Destroyer. In October 1917, Lenin snuck back into St. Petersburg and convinced the other Marxist leaders to prepare for an armed takeover. This was it. The big popular uprising Marxists had dreamed about for decades. However, many were hesitant even after agreeing to go forward. Lenin found their lack of faith disturbing. Enter Leon Trotsky. He and Lenin went back 15 years to before Lenin organized Europe's Marxists, and he later was a Menshevik. While Lenin was off doing his thing, Trotsky had worked his way up in the St. Petersburg Soviet. In October 1917, he was its leader. Lenin put Trotsky in charge of preparing the armed uprising, since Lenin could not show his face in public. Trotsky armed up and claimed it was for the Soviets' defense in these dangerous times. Trotsky was the Grand Moff Tarkin to Lenin's Darth Vader, and Trotsky was setting up the Death Star for Lenin. On November 7th, 1917, everything was ready. Lenin gave the word, and Marxists took over government buildings and other strategic spots. Representatives from all the Soviets had gathered in St. Petersburg, and they voted Lenin into power, officially forming the Soviet Union. The provisional government instantly disintegrated. In terms of speed, coordination, and upheaval, it was like the Execute Order 66 scene from Revenge of the Sith, where the clone troopers simultaneously take action all across the galaxy, while Palpatine has the Senate vote him Emperor back on Coruscant. Like Palpatine, Lenin had taken over by a show of arms, sheer force of will, and decades of preparation. Russia used a different calendar at the time, which is why this takeover is called the October Revolution, also known as Red October. Lenin had taken office, but he was still far from fully taking power. He kept his deal with the Germans and called off the war. However, this freed up a ton of soldiers for his opposition to use. Russia immediately pitched into years of civil war. Lenin would need to use extreme measures to take Russia. Now, Lenin was all in and would do whatever it took to stay in power, no matter who he had to kill or oppress. To help him keep power, Lenin created the Cheka, his secret police. Later, their name would be changed to the KGB. From here on, Lenin would live up to the idiom he made famous. You can't make an omelet without breaking eggs. There is so much material. I could do a whole series of episodes on the aftermath of the October Revolution. I'll just hit some of the highlights. The Russian royal family had been taken into custody by the provisional government and sent into hiding once Lenin came back in 1917. Problem was, Lenin literally took power overnight, so he immediately had access. Within a year, the royals were all shot dead, including the 5 children. It was rumored that the Tsar's daughter Anastasia somehow survived and escaped. That's actually the premise for the animated movie Anastasia. In 2007, genetic evidence actually revealed that nobody got out. Once the provisional government fell, all bets were off. Russia became a free-for-all of political factions. The 2 main contenders were Lenin's Red Army and the White Army led by Tsarist officers who wanted to restore the monarchy. The White Army was basically the rebel alliance and was backed by Western Europe and the United States. Things got awkward pretty quickly when the Red Army won after 3 years of fighting. After Lenin finally consolidated power, he implemented severe policies that oppressed the people far worse than the Tsars had. But karma struck. Just 2 years after the end of the Civil War, Lenin started suffering a series of strokes, which made him unable to lead Russia anymore. 2 more years later, in 1924, he died at age 53. His body was preserved and is still on public display in the building right next to the Kremlin in Red Square. After Lenin's death, Nadezhda Krupskaya remained a leader in Russia. Her influence slowly waned, but remarkably she managed to die of natural causes in the 1930s, when Soviet Russia was at its worst. I guess Stalin didn't consider Nadezhda a threat. She never bore Lenin any children. By the way, Krupskaya chocolate from Russia is named after her. Lenin's slow decline led to a major power battle over who would succeed him. Trotsky was the biggest contender, which also made him the biggest target. The other Russian leaders were so scared of Trotsky taking over that they gravitated to a charismatic young man who everybody underestimated: Joseph Stalin. By creating a practical form of Marxism, Lenin unleashed by far the deadliest political ideology in human history. It produced the top 2 largest mass murderers on record: Mao Zedong and Joseph Stalin. Even the more middle-of-the-road estimates put Mao alone at killing over 40 million, well over twice as many people as all of World War I. Almost the entire 20th century was defined by the struggle between the free nations and the Soviet Union. There are still nations under the control of Marxist governments. Today, Marxists are still using Lenin's methods to fight for control of countries all over the world. All of this was started by an idealistic guy who took a fringe ideology too far and became a villain. As always, we would love to hear your feedback. You can email us at historynachos@gmail.com. All one word, all lowercase. If you like the podcast, also make sure to leave a review on iTunes. For those of you that want more details of Lenin's story, he was a prolific writer to the end. Leon Trotsky and Nadezhda Krupskaya also wrote memoirs. However, if you choose to read these accounts, you need to be careful, since at times they will sound sympathetic. Remember exactly who the authors are: hardened radicals willing to kill innocent people for their ideology. it's a bit like reading Darth Vader's opinion on the Jedi and the Rebel Alliance. I wouldn't exactly classify them as objective observers. Also, for those of you who have not read Sun Tzu's The Art of War, I highly recommend picking up a copy. Or, of course, you can Google it. Until next time, thanks for listening.